Okay, so this is lecture 2 of Rashi and His World and the Origin of Ashkenazic Jews by Rabbi Lawrence Troster, and today is April 22nd, 2015. So last time we were setting the stage of Ashkenazic Jewry, and one of the issues that somebody asked about was the language, and I wanted to first of all talk a little bit about that before we get into the life of Rashi. So, what language did the Jews of the Rhine and France speak? This is a very interesting and complicated issue and goes to the heart of the arguments regarding the origin of Yiddish, which there are many arguments among scholars that have never been settled as to the origin of Yiddish. The problem is there's virtually no documentation. So, what is it? You'll notice on page 1, and that I quote a verse from. Somebody want to give me a Tanakh and pass it down, please? That I quote a verse from Psalm 114, which is well known because it's part of the Hallel Psalms. B'tzeit Yisrael mi Mitzrayim Beit Yaakov me'am lo'ez. B'tzeit Yisrael mi. All right, many of you know that. Okay, so no, it's okay. I got it, Paul. It's verse 1, and it means when Israel went out from Egypt, the house of Jacob from a foreign people, lo'ez. It's an unusual word in Hebrew, not used very often in the Tanakh. What happens is that the word, from this word lo'ez comes the word la'az, used in rabbinic literature. And la'az becomes a synonym for Latin, okay, in a lot of literature. In other words, when terminology is developed for, like Ashkenaz for Germania, you end up, the word la'az ends up meaning Latin. And then it means the Romance languages. So Italian, French, Spanish, and I forgot to put one in here, Provençal. So anything that is the Jews of these area are the ones who speak this la'az. In other words, they're speaking the early form of the Romance languages in the early Middle Ages. Old French, Old Spanish, whatever. The point is, it comes to mean the Romance languages. And then, eventually, it comes to mean any vernacular. Bela'az, in the vernacular. Okay? So, what we have in Rashi, as you will see, is a number of these attempts when there are sometimes a difficult word that he is trying to describe, and this is both in his biblical and Talmudic commentaries, he will tell you what the la'az is. And most of the time, and there are thousands of these, it's in Old French. In fact, Rashi is one of the most important sources for Old French vocabulary, since there's not a lot of manuscripts from this period of Old French. But, interestingly enough, there are 24 instances where he not only gives you the Old French, but the Old German, meaning the earliest Yiddish we have is in commentaries in Rashi. And there was an argument, there's been a lot of discussion among scholars as when the Yiddish is said, is it a later person putting the Yiddish in to explain the Old French? Well, they've gone back to the manuscripts, and in the earliest manuscripts, they can definitely say there are 24 instances in the Talmudic commentaries and the biblical commentaries of Rashi wrote it. So, even though Rashi was living in France and knew the la'az of France, Old French, he also had studied for years in the Rhine, and therefore he knew the Germanic la'az, which is the earliest manuscript written evidence for Yiddish. The very earliest, because the manuscripts date not too long after Rashi, apparently, very early manuscripts. And
Can I ask you,
yeah,
which alphabet did he use?
well, they always use the Hebrew alphabet. Always use the Hebrew alphabet. And that's part of the problem. There are no vowels, so it's sometimes difficult to know what the pronunciation of the word is. And scholars have spent, many years, going through these and trying to make sure they get the correct spelling of it.
PhD theses. And
Books written on it. Scholars, one guy spent his whole lifetime doing this. Yeah.
So, I don't know Yiddish, but there doesn't seem to be any old French remnants in the contemporary Yiddish.
Because that's right. Well, there are a few words in Yiddish that go back to the Latin roots of the la'as. In other words, if the Ashkenazic Jews, as I said last time, migrate from northern Italy into Germany, they're bringing with them the Italian la'as, and therefore some of those words find themselves into what becomes Yiddish, like the word bench, meaning to bless, coming from the Latin benedictus, okay? Sometimes it shows up in names, such as the women's name Yenta, which was a name originally, comes from gentila, or Bela, coming from Bella. There's a couple of men's names that also comes from that as well. So you get this northern Italian la'as goes into the Rhine, and from there, this is where the scholarly arguments are really thick and fast. And I read something yesterday that was written a few years ago. There are three theories about where Yiddish comes from in terms of the German dialects it was based on, because there was no single German language, and so it's quite interesting that nobody can definitively say, because what they do is they examine the Yiddish words and they compare it to these old German dialects and see, okay, there are particularities to the dialect which show up in Yiddish and so on and so forth. But you have to understand, the earliest Yiddish is from before the Jews started moving into Eastern Europe, so you have to, that's before all the Slavonic words came into Yiddish. So there, in other words, Old Yiddish is prior to that migration and has no Slavonic in it. So the three areas are the Rhine, which makes the most sense for our purposes, but also Bavaria, further south, because that makes sense because that's closer to Italy. Interestingly enough, there's another one that's sort of further to the east, almost on the border with Eastern Europe, and that one, geographically, historically, I don't know, it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense to me, but apparently there are some interconnections with the particular German dialect there. But nobody knows for sure. That's the ultimate answer. But it's evident that Rashi knew it, and here's an example of it. Okay? So if you open let's always look at the biblical verse. So we'll go to Ezekiel chapter 27. Verse 24, which is on page 1214. Now, as you'll see, Rashi wrote a commentary to almost every book of the Bible, and I just discovered that the Chabad site that has Rashi's commentary has his commentary in English to every single book of the Bible, by the way. Don't always like the translation, but it's pretty handy when you're cutting and pasting. Okay, so if you take a look in verse 24, this is talking about various countries and what they trade and various kinds of things, and this is where very often it's very difficult to know what the Hebrew original is talking about. Anyway, if you look at verse 24, would somebody like to read verse 24? These were your merchants.
In choice fabrics, embroidered cloaks of blue, and many colored carpets tied up with cords, and preserved with cedar among your wares. Okay, and the word for cedar there, va'aruzim. Okay, does it in fact, mean cedar? Okay, what does it mean? And what is it? What is it actually saying there? This is what Rashi has to say, because whereas our modern translation does say cedar, they didn't necessarily think that's what it was originally. So, and you want to read the comment on, here's an example that I'm giving you. This is on page 1 of the material, and enclosed in myrtle wood. Ed, you want to read that?
Jonathan
renders myrtle wood.
Now, he's referring here to a Targum, an Aramaic Targum. Okay, one of the Aramaic Targums translates it as myrtle wood, not cedar. Okay, and Rashi uses the Targums quite often. Go ahead.
Those chests were placed in chests of myrtle wood, and they would bring them into the outer chests, and the chest within them, and so too the ornaments that were inside the chests. Everything all together for merchandise.
Notice he's talking about his own time. Okay, that you would put cloth in a wooden box that would preserve the cloth because of the nature of the wood would stop moths.
I can see why they would say cedar then.
Well, yeah, because cedar is one of the, that's why we still have cedar closets, right? Evidently myrtle was used similar. And notice he's talking about there would be an inner lining or chest of myrtle wood, and then there'd be an outer one, which would, so this is very typical for medieval times. Read on. This is the meaning.
And so too the ornaments that were inside the chests. Everything all together for merchandising. This is the meaning of the wording in brief. And with treasures kept in chests, tied with ropes, and enclosed in cedar wood.
For the biromim.
For the biromim are the chests, and they were tied with ropes and placed in chests of myrtle, which is a species of cedar. And the adornments that were inside the chests, Jonathan calls...
You don't have to try and read the Aramaic. You can go on. Adornments.
Adornments that require good watching.
Keep going.
That were placed in chests.
Now, what's interesting is the what he calls the chests here, biromim, is in fact carpets tied up with cords. So in other words, he's following the Targum, which really doesn't know what the original means. Okay, go on.
And the word migdal in the Targum is like what we learn. A box and a chest, migdal. Shafrait in laaz, clothes chest, cupboard. Armaiz in Old French.
See that? An armoire, okay. So the original Hebrew doesn't say in Old French, but just says again, bela'az. So he's giving two lazim here. One is the Yiddish, and one is the what's called the Safartit, the French. Okay? So one is Ashkenazit, it's not called Yiddish yet, and the other is Safartit, the French. So this is one of the instances. As I said, there's about 24 of them. About 14 or so in the Talmudic commentaries, about 10 or so in the biblical commentaries. Not very many. But this shows you that Rashi was conversant in both of the vernaculars of the Jews at the time. And it shows you that the Jews of France, by Rashi's time, were already speaking a language that was different than the Jews of the Rhine. Okay? All right. Any questions at this point before we move on? Okay. So let's talk about the life of Rashi. So first of all, the acronym Rashi can mean several possibilities. One is just Rabbeinu or Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, meaning, Rabbi Solomon, the son of Yitzchak, or it can be Rabban Shel Yisrael, which means the Rabbi of Israel, meaning the great rabbi, the great sage, or Rabbeinu Sheyichye, our rabbi, may he live. So again, we're not sure what Rashi originally comes from, because usually if it's so-and-so son of so-and-so, it's rabbi, so-and-so son of, there would be a bait, and then the idea of Shlomo Yitzchaki would be very unusual. So it's probably more likely one of these two. We know he was born in Troyes in 1040. His father was a scholar. He quotes at the very beginning of Genesis his father on the very first comment to the beginning of Genesis, which we will look at next week. He basically says, Rabbi Isaac said. That's his father. So he quotes his very first comment to the Torah is his father's teaching. But he mentions in the Talmudic commentary to Avodah Zarah that his father was a scholar. We don't know his mother's name, but she, very typical, women's names were often not mentioned. She was the sister of Simon ben Yitzchak, the elder, who was a writer of liturgy, and who was also a disciple of Rabbeinu Gershom ben Jehuda of Mainz, what we call Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah. He is the first great Ashkenazic rabbi in the Rhine. We'll get back to him. Rashi already comes from a family of scholars. But he's born in France, in Troyes, and Troyes is a very important town in his time. There had been a town there since Roman times. Apparently, it was on a very important Roman road from southern France to the German border of the empire, and it had been the seat of a bishopric, since the 4th century CE, and since the 9th century, it was the capital of Champagne. And Champagne was a province within the Holy Roman Empire that was ruled by a count. And for centuries, the Count of Champagne had his headquarters in Troyes. The reason they located it there was because of the Viking invasions to the north. Now, where is Troyes? Anybody know? In France? It's 150 kilometers outside of Paris, to the east, southeast. Okay, so if you look at Champagne, Troyes is there. It's still, it was a thriving town for many, many, many centuries. But at the time of Rashi, it was an important international trade center. There was a very important trade fairs there. So people were constantly coming through from all over the place. And we know that there was an organized Jewish community in the 11th century, in the time of Rashi. Why? Because we have documentation about it. And one of the things that the Troyes community tried to do, by the way, was to impose its rules on surrounding smaller little communities, so they would come under the rule of the community of Troyes. And Rashi, there's a response of Rashi about this, and he said, yeah, that's what it should be. Well, of course, he was the head of the rabbinical court, so, why not? Probably in his day, there were no more than 100 people in the Jewish community. Again, we're talking about relatively small communities. And the Jews, they were involved in real estate, including vineyards, which is where you get this idea that somehow Rashi owned a vineyard. We have no evidence that Rashi actually owned a vineyard and made wine, but there were Jews involved in owning vineyards. Whether they were involved in the production of wine, who knows? Okay? We know who his teachers were because he went at a young age first of all, to the yeshiva in Mainz, the Talmudic school in Mainz that existed already in the 11th century, and his students were Yaakov ben Yakar and Yitzchak ben Yehuda, who are the great Talmudic scholars at that time at the yeshiva in Mainz. They themselves were the disciples of this Rabbeinu Gershom, okay? And eventually he also went to Worms, where there was another great yeshiva, and he studied with a guy named Yitzchak ben Elazar Halevi. And apparently the methods of the two of these scholars from the Mainz yeshiva as opposed to the Worms yeshiva were quite different. And Rashi combined both of these. We'll get more into that when we talk about his Talmudic material. When he was 28 years old, when he was already married and he already had at least one daughter, at least one daughter, he moved back to Troyes around 1070, and he founded his own yeshiva. And it became quite prominent. And some of his students were Simcha ben Samuel of Vitry, whose son, who they wrote the Machzor Vitry, a guy named Shemaiah, another one named Yehuda ben Avraham, Joseph ben Yehuda, and Yaakov ben Samson. Some of these people we don't know very much about, but his students, as you'll see I'll describe it later on, become the founding of what's called the Tosafot school of Talmudic study. We don't know what his wife's name was. Again, people didn't tend to do that. We know he had 3 daughters, Yocheved, and Rachel and Miriam. And Yocheved was married to a colleague of his, somebody he studied with, fellow student at Mainz, named Meir ben Shmuel. And they had 4 sons. Shmuel, who is known as Rashbam. Yaakov, who became known as Rabbeinu Tam. 2 of the most important Talmudic scholars of their generation were his grandsons. Another son, Yitzchak, called the Rebam, and also another son named Solomon. Now Miriam married someone named Yehuda ben Natan, and she had sons Yom Tov, Shimon, Eliezer, and we know about a couple of them because they travel around and go to various places and become scholars where they are. His daughter, the daughter of Miriam and Yehuda was someone named Alvina, and we know that she was the ancestor of a famous 13th century Ashkenazic rabbi, Elazar of Worms, who is very, very important in the rise of what's called the Hasidei Ashkenaz, a pietistic movement in Germany in the 13th century, not related to the later Hasidic movement. Okay? And we know that his daughter Rachel was also known as Bel Azeh, and she was married and divorced to a man named Eliezer ben Shammai, and we don't really know anything further about it. So his sons-in-law, his students, and his grandsons, and their descendants and their students founded the Talmudic school of what's called the Tosafot. And the Tosafot are rabbis from France and Germany, and there were some, by the way, also in northern Spain, who are among those known in Talmudic scholarship as the Rishonim. When you hear about the Rishonim, you're talking mostly about the Tosafot, meaning the early generations of European Talmudic scholarship. Now, the term Rishonim can also refer to people, in the Sephardic countries as well, by the way. And what they did was they created critical and explanatory glosses or questions and notes, interpretations, rulings, and sources on the Talmud. And they're called additions because they were additions to Rashi's commentary on the Talmud. And sometimes they, disagreed with him and all these kinds of things. And when you look at a page of Talmud, and I brought the least heavy volume, this convention of the printed page of the Talmud dates from Italy in the Renaissance, in the 16th century. And Rashi always gets the inside of the page, the place of honor. All right? I mean, this is based on the standard Vilna edition from the 19th century, but essentially this idea of putting the commentaries on the page comes much earlier. The original printing of Talmudic commentaries, by the way, were separate from the text of the Talmud. And there are many commentaries that are not in the printed editions not on the Talmudic page, that are separate commentaries. There's a bunch that we used to call the boys at the back of the volume, but there's also separate volumes of certain scholars that didn't make it into the standard Vilna edition. But anyway, this is the Rashi. It's in Rashi's script. Okay, he's always in the inside page, and on the outside is the Tosafot. And whereas Rashi is a running commentary, the Tosafot, as you can see, the larger Hebrew script, deal with particular passages, like they're little paragraphs and discussions, and they represent several centuries worth of this. The Tosafot basically are from the 12th century to the middle of the 15th century. And what happens is any scholars who write after the 15th century are called the Achronim, the later generations. If the early ones are the Rishonim, the first generations, the Achronim are the later generations. So, for example, the Shulchan Aruch, the great compilation of Jewish law that was Yosef Karo wrote in the 16th century, he's the Achronim. That's the Achronim. Okay? Yeah.
The central part is the Talmud.
That's the Talmud text itself.
Right, so in the inside is Rashi.
The inside is Rashi.
On the outside, on the page on the right, there seems to be a smaller comment.
Yeah, these are other people.
other pages.
Okay, these are, I mean, what happens is when the Vilna edition gets printed, they, depending upon the tractate, they add other people. Okay, and there's also people in, who did little notations that cross-reference things. Okay, so that, yeah, every page is, and tractates are different as to which are those extra ones, which ones they decided to choose. But the ones, the central and the oldest, the ones we're talking about, they're not the oldest. Rashi and the Tosafot are not the oldest Talmudic commentaries, by the way. There are earlier ones from North Africa, but they didn't, they weren't as extensive. As I said last time, when we, studying the Talmud became studying the Talmud through the lens of Rashi. And you can't even separate the two in many ways. So that's one of Rashi's greatest achievements, is the creation of this school, which included his own literal descendants. Okay? And we know approximately 47 rabbis in the Tosafot from these centuries. There are probably more, but we know 47. Again, we know very little about Rashi's life, but we know that from his commentaries, especially those in the Talmud, that he had extensive knowledge of all kinds of day-to-day things about business and trade and various other things. And I want to just show you what we do know is that he kept in contact with his friends and colleagues in the Rhine, but he, thank God, was not there in 1099 when the first Crusade massacres occurred. Now, this was the culmination in 1096. 1096. I made a mistake there. Of a number of attacks on Jews in the Germanic area. But the big ones took place in the summer or the spring of 1096, when there were different Crusader armies that were gathering to go to the east. There was what you might call the real regular armies of some of the kings and nobles that was very disciplined, and and so on and so forth. And then there were kind of a larger sort of rabble under lower level knights and various other things and lay people. The first Crusade's often been called the People's Crusade, and it was a mess. And what happened was that when they entered certain towns, they attacked the Jews. And in most places, the local authorities tried to stop them, and tried, especially in Worms and Mainz, the bishops tried to defend the Jewish community. The Jews themselves put up a fight, but the problem was there were people inside the town who sided with these people, and they went after them, and it was terribly unfortunate, but it resulted in the massacre in Mainz of about 800 Jews and about 1,100 in Worms. And many of them, the many rabbis and so on, and we actually have the names of most of the scholars who were killed there in the Memor books, the Yortzeit books of these communities that were written down, which the earliest manuscripts still survive. And it was from this that the communities developed the idea of the Yisker. Okay, that was originally done only on Yom Kippur. They would read the names. This happened for centuries afterwards. They would read the names of those who were killed and call upon them as holy martyrs to intercede with them in heaven with God to forgive their sins. That's where it comes from. And it started originally only on Yom Kippur, and then it's eventually spread to the rest of the of it.
What does it mean exactly?
Yisker? Well, it's the beginning of the paragraph that one recites. Yiskor Elohim, may God remember. It means may God remember.
Or may remember.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So we know from later from his descendants who wrote this in manuscripts, they claim that he died on July 13th, 1105, which was the 29th of Tammuz, and he was buried in the cemetery in Troyes. The cemetery in Troyes eventually was, when the Jews were expelled from France, basically got obliterated. But scholars have claimed to have, through various means, feel they know the place of where the old Jewish cemetery of Troyes was. And eventually they erected this monument to Rashi in that locale. It's a big giant sphere with the acronym Rashi cut out metal. And also in the last decade, well, maybe 20 years, there was a plaque that was put up in the area claiming, saying that this was originally a Jewish cemetery with the graves of many great scholars. So but we don't, we're not 100% sure because any real evidence of the cemetery is gone and we wouldn't be able to, know exactly where he was buried. So that's Rashi's life. Anybody, again, the details, because unlike Maimonides, we don't have the kind of biographical details that we have for somebody like Maimonides. And by the way, that's more normal for Jewish, for figures in the Middle Ages, not to know so much about them. Yes, Suzanne?
I'm sure many of us have read Rashi's Daughter,
Yeah.
the first one, and I think what struck me about it was the amount of superstition at the time, and I'm wondering if the author who wrote that, is really accurate about that. I remember when she came and spoke to us, I asked about that. And also if that's reflected in Rashi's writings at all.
Well,
There seem to have been, many superstitious practices that the Jews had, as well as everybody else.
everybody did. Well, so let me say one thing, which I have not talked about. There are a lot of legends about Rashi. There are in later works, in the late Middle Ages and and afterwards, there are legends about famous Jewish rabbis that are based on no historical evidence whatsoever. So there's tons of legends about Rashi, and I think maybe the author of those books may have drawn upon those legends, first of all, which is why I haven't mentioned them, because there's no historical basis for them. They're miracle stories, but that's like saint stories. This is not unusual in the Jewish Middle Ages.
It's more like the evil eye, or
Yes.
the dangers
Yes.
of pregnant women, and
So
what you did to prevent
the answer
that.
is everybody believed this stuff, that it was a widely accepted, and this had existed since ancient times, even biblical times, belief in demons.
Yeah, demons.
And demons are the chief cause of illness. You have to look at them as viruses. They were the equivalent of viruses. They were invisible. And so there was a host of, you can call it superstition, you can call it magic, practices that one did. And again, they're in the Talmud. It's in the Talmud, a lot of this stuff, but there's, of course, what happens is there's this long tradition of this stuff, the evil eye, definitely a lot of Talmudic material on the evil eye. And of course, they absorbed a lot of the local ideas. And you get some rituals that develop that are meant to keep the demons away and to keep the evil eye away. In Germany, there was one called the Holocaust ceremony, which is quite ancient. I don't know how far it goes back. When a baby was born, there would be this ceremony where children of the community would gather around the crib of the baby and would recite a formula, something like "Hola Christ, what shall this baby's name be?" This was done in Jewish homes. In fact, my wife's grandmother told us that they did it for her sons when they were born. My father-in-law and his 4 younger brothers. Where does that formula come? What is Hola? Nobody really knows for sure. It probably comes from Germanic folklore, though. So there's a whole host of stuff. Late Rabbi Joshua Trachtenberg of Temple Emeth wrote the first great scholarly account of what Jewish magic and superstition, an unbelievable piece of scholarship. It's been superseded by a lot of stuff, but it's still an incredible source for all this stuff if you want to read about it. And I think I taught a course once on it too, or some lectures. Yeah.
I understand that Rashi's comments and interpretations are very difficult to understand.
No, they're not.
They're not.
They're not, actually. They're not difficult to understand. In fact, his idea is to try and explain to you the text. So he's doing it within he's doing it within the context of his time. So sometimes, it requires some explanation, but what it is that the common question that's often asked when people study Rashi's commentary is, in Hebrew, it's ma kasheh l'Rashi. What is bothering Rashi? What is prompting him to make a comment on this particular word or phrase or verse? And it's not always easy to tell exactly why he comments on some things but not on others. Okay? So maybe that's where you heard that from. But he's actually a fairly readable commentary. Well, we're going to get to that now. Okay? Any other questions about his life? All right. So he wrote his commentary on all the books of the Bible except the last chapters of Job and the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. And we know that there are very likely, during his own lifetime, some of his students would put in annotations to his commentary or after his life. So when we read his commentary, sometimes there's been other people's stuff has been incorporated into his commentary, and it's not always easy to figure it out. But one of the ones we can figure out is his grandson, who wrote his own commentaries, Rashbam. If you look at Rashi's commentary on Exodus 15, verse 6, it's pretty likely based on Rashbam's commentary that his stuff was incorporated in it, and some of his others that we've been able to identify is, somebody named Yosef Kara. That's not the same as Yosef Karo, and Shemaiah. Yeah.
Is that a typo? 15:6. It should be were probably done.
Were. Yes, you're right. Okay, so what was his method? What was he trying to do? He was trying to create a commentary of what's called pshat. And pshat means the plain sense of Scripture, independent of the Talmudic commentaries, which are in the Midrashim, which is known as drash. Drash are more homiletical, symbolic, allegorical. Technically speaking, allegorical is called remez, which was the philosophical. But when we look at the rabbinic commentaries on the Bible, from the collections of Midrashim and all kinds of other sources, you find that it doesn't always follow the exact plain sense of the text. So Rashi was part of a revolution in biblical commentary that was occurring in the 11th century in France, Germany, France, and Spain, where where various authors were trying to write the plain sense of the text. What does the text say without reference to rabbinic midrash? That's a big change. Okay? Now, Rashi is a kind of mediating figure in this revolution. He often will tell you what the rabbinic midrash is. But he's also trying sometimes to tell you the pshat. And in some cases, he's trying to present the pshat without discrediting the drash. The place where this occurs in the most obvious way is in his commentary to the Song of Songs. And by the way, this is all really well described, this process, in the new commentary to the Song of Songs that was put out by the Jewish Publication Society, written by Michael Fishbane. Okay, it's amazing, okay? So what Fishbane basically says that what had come down to the Jewish community interpreting the Song of Songs. On the surface, the Song of Songs is a collection of erotic love poems. That's what it is. But, so how did it get into the Bible? Because it was already seen as an allegory of the relationship between God and Israel, where God is the man and Israel is the woman. So there was already this allegorical interpretation of the Song of Songs that goes back to the editing of the book itself into the Bible. Later Jewish generations just went with this allegory. You see it And of course, the Christian church picks it up, by the way. And so the Christian interpretation of the Song of Songs sees it as an allegory between God and the church. But, there's a famous statement that Rabbi Akiva said, if all the books of the Bible are holy, the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. How could he say that? Because for him, it was a mystical allegory about the, more than just not only the corporate body of Israel, but the soul of the individual. And by the way, the Kabbalists, carried on with that. So what happens is that in the 11th century, scholars are trying to write a commentary to the Song of Songs to say, okay, what is it just saying? And yet they can't discredit the allegory. Because to discredit the allegory is to discredit the rabbinic interpretation of it, which is to discredit the Talmudic
And then
understanding.
Why did it get here?
Yeah, exactly. And then it just becomes a bunch of erotic poetry. And there is already a Talmudic dictum that you're not supposed to, chant the Song of Songs as an erotic ditty at a wedding. Okay, which evidently people must have been doing. Okay, and by the way, there are modern Israeli songs based on Song of Songs that are sung at weddings, Erev Shel Shoshanim. All right, that's not meant as an allegory. So it's fascinating. So this is something that Rashi tried to not discredit the drash while trying to explain the pshat. His grandson Rashbam went completely for the pshat on all circumstances, including Song of Songs, as did Spanish scholars like Ibn Ezra. The problem comes in the commentary to the Torah, where the pshat clashes with the halacha as developed by the rabbinic tradition, which is not necessarily based on the pshat, but is based on the drash. And that's a very tricky thing to negotiate. Okay? Yeah.
Can you give an example of halacha that's based on?
Yeah, look at the next one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We'll get to that. We'll look at it right now. Rashi doesn't, on the Song of Songs, let's leave that one aside. The point is that Rashi doesn't use his commentary of the Torah to promulgate new halacha, but he does describe the halacha. And so let's take a look at one of the most famous ones. Look at Exodus 34:26. This is after the golden calf, and there's this is on page 189. 190. In the process of retelling some details of the covenant, and I don't want to get into the, people feel this is from a particular original source, is kind of another version of the Ten Commandments. But if you take a look at verse 26, it says, "The choice first fruits of your soil shall you bring to the house of the Lord your God," and then a new sentence, "You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk." Now, okay, so look at what Rashi says. This is on number 3. You shall not cook a kid. Muriel, you want to read it? This is the warning.
Not about promulgating halacha.
No, just start where it says.
You shall not cook a kid. This is the warning against cooking meat and milk together. This commandment is written in the Torah 3 times.
Which is true, okay? So it's exactly the same phrase 3 times. Now the pshat would be, well, it's a redundancy, okay? But the rabbinic tradition didn't take it that way. Read on.
One for eating, one for deriving benefit, and one for the prohibition of cooking.
And he's quoting here from Tractate Chulin in the Talmud, or he's alluding to it, page 115b. So the rabbinic tradition says there can't be any redundancy in the Torah. There's no such thing as redundancy. So why is this commandment given 3 times? The drash is because it's referring to cooking, eating, and deriving benefit. So here is where Rashi quotes you the rabbinic drash, even though that's not the pshat.
Also, does it mean that if it's repeated, it's more important? Did they mean,
No.
no?
There has to
Mean
be
that.
some meaning, some content
Some
to it.
different meaning.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Exactly.
Aren't there occasions when something is repeated immediately following?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they find
Isn't that supposed to be for
Is that
importance?
there's when you're talking about modern understanding of it, yes, sometimes repetitions are used for intensification of meaning. And sometimes we know that repetitions are from different sources, but of course that Rashi didn't believe that. So the rabbinic tradition doesn't see anything as redundant, and they try to reconcile if there's a conflict between repetition sources, or what we call sources. The Talmudic tradition reconciles those contradictions, because there can't be a contradiction in the Torah, because it's only one source according to the rabbinic understanding of it. Muriel, read the next part.
Any young offspring is meant, even a calf or a lamb.
In other words, what is the word gedi? Is it only refer to a certain kind of animal? Okay, read on. Since the Torah
had to specify in many places.
gedi izim, when a young goat is meant.
You learn that mention of
Gedi.
unqualified means all sucklings.
In other words, if it's got a qualification, izim, it refers to a goat. If it's just gedi, it means a young animal. Read on. In its mother's milk.
This excludes fowl which has no milk, which is not prohibited by the Torah, but by the decree of the scribes.
Now, what this means is the original is that chicken, fowl, any kind of fowl is not considered meat for purposes of mixing milk and meat. In other words, the Torah is only specifying land animals, cows, goats, sheep,
That's
right?
That's suckle.
Okay, that suckle. But the rabbis, so that's what's considered the Doraita, the Torah law. Again, even though it's drash, it's halacha, it's halachic midrash. The rabbis create what's called midrabanan, an extra prohibition, which they do on quite a bit, to stop people from eating meat and milk. They include things that are meat-like, therefore fowl meat.
So it's a fence around the Torah.
Yes, that's what's called putting a fence around the Torah. Interestingly enough, there was some, fish don't apply, and eggs aren't applied to it. So there are some things that are not so clear cut, but it was very clear that in the 2nd century, at the time of the promulgating of the Mishnah, there were sages who didn't believe that fowl should be part of this prohibition of meat and milk, but the majority opinion was that they should, and that became the standard Jewish practice. So Rashi here is just quoting us the Talmudic understanding. He's not, you'll notice, trying to get the pshat here, partly because nobody really knows what the pshat is. In other words, what does this law mean? Why is it here? Even to this day, no, not everybody, we don't really know. But take a look in number 2. Here's another way of understanding it. Rashi himself tells us what he's trying to do in his commentary. So if you go to Genesis 3, verse 8, which is found on page 5, the verse says, they, meaning Adam and Eve, heard the sound of the Lord moving about in the garden at the breezy time of the day. And the man and his wife hid from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. So, and they heard. Okay, Irma, do you want to read that? There are many kinds. I'm on page 2 here, number 2, double I.
And they heard. There are many kinds of Agadic midrashim, and our sages already arranged them in their proper order in Genesis Rabbah and in other midrashim. But I have come only to teach the plain sense of Pshuto, of the scripture, and such Agadah that clarifies the words of the verses, each word in its proper way.
So, he claims that what he's writing is pshat. Now, that's what he says, all right? But in fact, what is he calling about Agadic midrashim? There are two kinds of midrashim. There are halachic midrashim, midrash halacha, that deal with legal things, like we just read with the meat and milk. And then there is midrash agadah, which is everything else. That's the best way to describe agadah. Agadah is anything that is not halacha. So, especially on the narrative parts of Torah, there are many different midrash agadah, including the really big collections of what's called the Midrash Rabbah. But he says he's only going to give us the Agadic Midrash when it clarifies the meaning of a word. And we know what he quotes. We know the Midrashim that he quotes, and sometimes he quotes more than one, usually no more than two, but sometimes more, because often there are multiple midrashim on any particular verse. The collections of midrash preserve all kinds of interpretations because many of these midrashim have their origins in public sermons. So, got to do a new sermon every year on the same parsha, so, come up with something else. The point is, he's claiming that his intention in this commentary is to create a pshat commentary and only refers to the midrash agadah when necessary. Okay? But his grandson, Rashbam, thinks that he failed in this. And Rashbam's commentary is is much more radical than Rashi's. If Rashi is a mediating figure between the rabbinic midrash and this new attempt to understand the pshat based on grammar and all kinds of things, his grandson said, not good enough, Zeta. And you want to see? Because Rashbam actually talks about it in his commentary. So if you take a look at he's talking about Genesis 37 too. It's always good to look at which verses these people are making their comments on, right? So if you go to Genesis 37, verse 2, page 77, it's the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev, and it's, just talking about the line of Jacob, right? And the beginning of the story of Joseph. So this is where he throws this thing in, because evidently he's trying, there must, the midrashim, there are all kinds of midrashim about Joseph. So, Irma, you want to read this? Those who love pure reason.
Those who love pure reason should always remember that the sages have said a biblical passage must not be deprived of its plain meaning. Because the main point of Torah comes to teach us and tell us in hints found in the plain meaning of the text, the Haggadot and Halachot and laws derived through lengthy words, and the 32 and 13 laws by which we derive law from the text of the Torah.
He's talking about the homiletical principles that the rabbis developed. The 13 are what are called the homiletical principles of Rabbi Ishmael. They go back quite a ways. They are rules of interpretation. Go on.
The Rishonim, because of their piety.
And now when he says Rishonim here, he's talking about the Talmudic rabbis. Go on.
Because of their piety, busied themselves with the drashot as their focus, and they did not regularly delve into the plain meaning of the text. And because the Chachamim said not to spend too much time with logic, and expressed the significance not of learning Torah, but of learning Talmud as having no greater measure, they did not regularly engage in establishing the plain meaning of the text.
This is fascinating. Okay? He's in effect saying the drashot for sermons, which sermons were meant to, teach people, but also console them about their lot. A lot of rabbinic sermons from the Talmudic period end with eschatological hope. You may be persecuted now, but don't worry, the Messiah is going to come and all this. So the focus of a drash is often to not only to teach people meaning, but also to give them comfort. So what is Rashbam saying, in effect? That's what their focus was when they interpreted the Torah. And they also, the Chachamim, which is, again, Talmudic rabbi, said, you're not supposed to spend too much time worrying about logic. And they didn't spend a lot of time studying the Torah text, but the Talmud text. And so they didn't establish the plain meaning of the text of the Torah. This is pretty radical stuff, isn't it? Okay, read on. Even Rashi.
Rashi, the father of my mother, set his heart to explain the plain meaning of the text. Even my grandfather, Shlomo,
That's Rashi.
was an adherent of this school, and I had an argument with him on that account, in which he admitted that he would make new commentaries according to the plain meanings that arise each day.
In other words, Rashbam claims he had an argument with his Zeta over saying, you didn't really make a pshat commentary, Zeta.
Yeah.
And Rashi basically said, yeah, you're right, and I got to revise it. And Rashi probably, continued to revise it, but the way it came down to us, it's not the pshat like you read Rashbam's commentary or Ibn Ezra's commentary. It's still very much filled with a lot of drashot, and so that's why it's a kind of mediating commentary between the old system and this new focusing on the plain meaning of the text. And when you get to somebody like Ibn Ezra is a lot more familiar with what we would call scientific philology, which Rashi was not. Rashi did get involved in Hebrew grammar and so on, but he was not aware, he didn't have any knowledge of the incredible advances in Hebrew philology that had occurred in the Spanish biblical scholars like Ibn Ezra and others who were writing grammars based upon Arabic models, because Arabic and Hebrew are very similar in structure. So they took Arabic grammatical models and Arabic philology, and they applied it to Hebrew, and they were finding out stuff about, and so a lot of the way in which we even learn Hebrew today, and this, how the verbs are promulgated, that all comes from this early Spanish philological work that Rashi was not aware of, or we have no evidence of. It's not that he didn't know Hebrew grammar, but he didn't know scientific Hebrew grammar. But Rashbam was evidently more familiar with it, and certainly Ibn Ezra is one of the masters of it. So Rashi is a kind of, as I said, is a kind of transitional figure between this drash commentary and the more strict pshat commentary that was coming out of in Spain and in Europe.
Where would you find this writing of Rashbam? Would that be in his commentary?
Yeah, that's in the commentary. So he made whatever he made his comment on that particular verse. He then did this little aside.
And he comments on his grandfather.
Yeah, exactly. He mentions Rashi several occasions, by the way. Yeah.
How widely known was Rashi during his own lifetime?
Quite well known, and very quickly after his death, his commentary was considered fairly authoritative. In other words, it became extremely popular. Ibn Ezra didn't know it, or if he did, he doesn't refer to it. But already in the 13th century, Nachmanides, who is in northern Spain, knows Ibn Ezra, knows Rashi, knows Maimonides, and is like talking about all of these different writers when he's writing his commentary. Yeah.
Just in terms of how Rashi supported himself.
Yeah.
Was he also a businessman?
Probably. He probably had, yeah.
So he had to do something to support him, in addition to all this teaching and writing
and he was the head of the rabbinical court in Troyes. Now, he does talk about the fact that earlier on, when he is a student, he was very poor.
I would say like Maimonides, who did all of his incredible work and worked as a doctor.
Yeah, Rashi, most of the people, there was no professional rabbinate at the time. Whether the heads of the yeshivas were paid for, might be something else. But most of them had other sources of income.
So it's incredible what they accomplished.
Exactly, when you think about it. Because he was probably working pretty much up to his death.
And the political comment of today is, to all those guys that are studying but not working in Israel today.
That became eventually the practice in Eastern Europe, that there was supposed to be a select group of scholars who did not work.
Right.
What you're seeing today is very modern.
Yeah.
And Maimonides would have disapproved of anybody not working, by the way. He said so very specifically. Okay, so we know he used the Targum Onkelos in his commentaries, especially on the prophets, to understand the meaning of certain words. Targum is the Aramaic translation. He also refers to it in his Torah commentary. And he also used other Targums, including the Targum Jonathan. Now, the Targum Onkelos is an attempt to have a fairly literal translation of the biblical text into Aramaic. There are some interpretive qualities to every translation, but Targum Onkelos really tries to stay to be a fairly strict translation. Targum Jonathan is a midrashic Targum, where there's a lot of midrashim are incorporated in it. And Rashi uses both of them. We know that in his Torah commentary alone, there's at least 1,000 Old French words, 1,000 times when he says, this is what it is in Laz. Okay? The commentary was probably meant for the literate masses. In other words, it was not meant just for the scholars. And there was probably a fairly high degree of literacy in these communities, even amongst the women, because they were small, and because learning, and when it became a literate culture, this was something extremely important, and people had to be literate in their business practices and so on and so forth. And we know that many women were quite learned and were often conducting independent businesses and affairs. There is in the Talmud a category of women called important women, who have much more latitude in conducting public business, owning property, and all kinds of other things. Well, apparently in Ashkenaz, in one of the texts, there said all our women are important. They all fall under this category. And so it wouldn't surprise me that, his daughters were probably fairly learned. And there were a lot of women who we know of women who were learned, and in fact, some of them, again, historically, this is difficult to prove, were actually, teachers of other women. There's a famous, there's a picture. Oops, let me show it to you. I forgot that I had it. Of a page of one of the illuminated machzors, Haggadahs from Ashkenaz, and I'll call up in a minute, that actually shows us this in a pictorial form. Yes, sorry, Stephen, what were you going to ask?
Yeah, how common was printing at Rashi's time?
There is no printing in Rashi's time.
So it's all by scribes?
It's all written by manuscripts, which is, of course, one of the reasons why one of the most important things that Rashi did in his Talmudic commentary was also to establish what the text of the Talmud was. Because don't forget, he's working from manuscripts that draw upon probably from Rabbeinu Gershom. So everything is by handwritten manuscripts, and books therefore are very expensive. And not that many of them were owned by people.
They didn't have books; they just had scrolls.
Oh, they had books by that point. Oh yeah, the Codex had been around for centuries. The Torah the scrolls were still scrolls, but there were plenty of Jews. Non-biblical stuff was written in was from used the Codex model. Let me just find that. Where is it? That's odd. Hang on. Can't seem to find it. I'll try and point it out. The point is that there is this marvelous picture in this machzor showing men and women with books discussing things at the Seder, and it's quite amazing. I thought I saved a copy of it. All right, somewhere I did. I'll put it in. I'll show it to you next week, and I'll also include it in the recording. So Rashi's commentary was read quite widely, and he probably also occasionally used drawings. If you go to Numbers 34, which is
366,
365.
365,
yeah, we're looking at verse 4.
366.
We're looking at 366, verse 4. It discusses the boundaries of the land of Israel that are going to be drawn up when they occupy the land. And in Rashbam's commentary, he says, "Our master, my grandfather, has explained those boundaries and drawn maps of them." So it could be that occasionally in his commentary he drew diagrams, but they don't survive. Now, he also mentions some interesting contemporary issues and events. So if you go to Exodus 28, this is a very interesting comment. 28:4, which is for 172. This is about the installation of Aaron and his sons as the priests, and the initiation or the ordination. And it says in verse 4, it talks about the vestments that they have to make, right, which have already been described. And then it refers to the priestly service as filling the hands. Here it's invest them with full authority, but it really means, the literal thing is filling the hands. Okay? They shall make those. Wait a second, I may have got the verse wrong. Maybe it's 14. It's here. The point is, hang on. There's a reference to this idea that if you take a look, it's verse 40, sorry. I made a typo. Look on page 175. It says, "And for Aaron's sons you shall make tunics," and so on and so forth. "Put them on them," verse 41, "and ordain them and consecrate them to me as priests." Now, literally, in the word ordain means "and fill their hands." Okay, here translated as "invest them with full authority." It's actually verse 40, 41. Okay, so this is what Rashi says. Cal, do you want to read it? Every mention of filling of the hands.
Every mention of filling of the hands is an expression of initiation. When a person begins something such as a position that he will be in possession of from that day on, it is referred to as filling a position. In Old French,
in the Hebrew, it says balaz. Go on.
In Old French, when they appoint a person to be in charge of something, the ruler puts in his hands a leather glove called guanto, gant in modern French, gauntlet in English, and thereby he grants him authority over the matter. They call this transmission revestir, invest, transmit, this glove, and this is the expression of filling of the hands.
So he's describing a ritual that occurs in feudal relationships. When a ruler appoints something to an office, he gives him his gauntlet, his leather glove, the guanto in Old French, and he puts it into his hand, and it's a symbolic act of investiture. So Rashi's claiming, he's explaining the meaning of the phrase filling of the hands in the biblical text with reference to what happens in his own day.
Right, guantes in Spanish.
Yes.
Okay, so there you go, you see. Probably coming from a Latin root originally.
What would Rashbam say?
I don't know. I don't know what Rashbam said on this. I can look it up. But the point is, we know that from biblical scholarship, that's not what it means. But Rashi's explaining it to his audience who wouldn't be aware and know this modern medieval ritual of a public appointment of an official by a lord into their office, where a glove, a gauntlet, is put into their hands, taken from the ruler. Isn't that fascinating?
And that's what fills their hands.
That's what fills their hands, the glove. And there are numerous, things in his commentaries, both here and in the Talmudic commentaries, that show, he describes things with reference to his contemporary situation in 11th century France. Okay? And also, he probably alludes to the persecutions of the First Crusade. He wrote a commentary to this book of Psalms, which, by the way, within the last few years, there's been a publication of an English translation by the Jewish Publication Society of Rashi's commentary to the Psalms. It's available, also available online. And so, if you take a look at Psalm 38, this is very likely an allusion to what is going on, or what happened in 1096. This is verse 17, which is on page 1458. And the psalm is a psalm of a person who is being attacked, and it's really it's a psalm of tremendous pain about his enemies and crying out to God not to have God abandon the person, whoever wrote this. It's quite intense. But look what Rashi does with it. If you look at verse 17 on page 1458, "For I fear they will rejoice over me when my foot gives way. They will vaunt themselves against me." Verse 18, "For I'm on the verge of collapse. My pain is always with me." Now, this is the outcry of an individual. But look at how he interprets it. Cal, do you want to read that one as well?
For I said, lest they rejoice over me. For this reason we remain silent, because we say to ourselves, if we answer them brazenly, they may witness our downfall and rejoice over us when our feet falter. And they will magnify themselves over us, saying, weren't you boasting of your salvation? For I am ready for disaster. For this reason we are concerned lest they rejoice over us, because we were accustomed to blows and are always ready and prepared for disaster. And my pain is always before me. It is always prepared to come before me.
This has got to be an allusion to those persecutions. First of all, he's talking about the conflict with the Gentiles. What do we do when we get attacked verbally? We remain silent. We don't do this because we know what will happen. And the second comment is, we are accustomed to blows. So there's a couple other allusions like this, but he doesn't say it directly in his commentaries. But this is pretty much, most people feel this is an allusion to 1096. Anybody have any questions at this point? Yeah, Cal.
I have a sort of extended question.
Yeah.
Is Spinoza a follower of Rashbam?
No. No, you're talking a whole different level there. You're talking at the beginnings of modern biblical critical analysis, which is very different than what we have here. Okay? Remember, they didn't know about multiple sources and that kind of stuff. So what is pshat in the Middle Ages is not pshat today. Okay? Pshat today is modern biblical analysis with reference to other cognate languages and ancient Near Eastern literature, and what we know a lot more about biblical Hebrew grammar and history and all that stuff. Pshat back then is trying to establish, without reference to historical analysis, the plain meaning of the text. The last thing I want to point out about his commentary to the Torah, and we're going to look at it in selections from it next week. I'll pick out some passages that are well known. We'll look, for example, at the whole first chapter of Genesis is worth interesting looking at Rashi's commentary. people wrote super commentaries to his commentary. In other words, commentaries on the commentary. And there are 200 super commentaries to Rashi that were written in.
Accepted.
Well,
There must have been more. Which one?
well, you find them in some of them in the standard, what's called the Rabbinic Bible, which it's like a Talmudic text. I'll bring it in and show you. You've got the biblical text, and you've got Rashi, and you've got Nachmanides and Rashbam and Ibn Ezra, and down at the bottom you've got super commentaries. There were super commentaries to Ibn Ezra as well. So I mean, a lot of this stuff is probably still in manuscript and has never been printed. But there was a lot of people who read his commentary and then wanted to comment on it, like his grandson did occasionally. So it's really. His commentaries are amazing, tour de force, and as I said, they are for Jews who begin studying the Torah through the lens of Rashi. It is the way you learn what, in many cases, not only what medieval Jews thought, but what did the Talmudic rabbis think the meaning of a verse was. In other words, it's an introduction to rabbinic literature. That's one of the reasons why it's still, even in the non-Orthodox world, it's so interesting and important. And there are at least 2, if not 3, published English translations. This was one of the most common one, in 5 volumes, done originally back in 1929 by M. Rosenbaum and Silberman. And it's... gives you the Torah text, an old translation, gives you Onkelos, interestingly enough, without translating it, and then puts Rashi into square script, so it's a lot easier to read, with the vowels, by the way. And then here is the English translation of Rashi, where he fills in words if Rashi doesn't have them, and then there are notes to the commentary in the appendix. So this is a very readable English translation. There's also, I think, 1 or 2 others that have come out, and as I said, you can get it online. You can get the Rashi translations
Who's the author
online.
of the book?
What?
Who's the author of the book?
Well, it's the standard, what's called the Silberman, and it's in 5 volumes, and I think it's in paperback, and it's been reprinted so many times, and so on. Yeah.
The commentaries in the Hertz Bible are almost all Rashi?
No. He bases himself on, you're talking about Hertz? Yeah, Hertz. Yeah. He bases himself on all of the biblical, traditional biblical commentary, all the way up, and Talmudic stuff. He's sort of condensing all of that. He's not strictly based on Rashi, no. Okay? Good. We'll see you next week.